On a Tuesday morning in late August of 2019, Linnea Vandermeer stood at the edge of her father's hayfield in Hardin County, Iowa, and watched $47,000 worth of baled hay smolder inside a barn that had been standing since 1962. The fire marshal's report would call it spontaneous combustion. The neighbors would call it bad luck. Linnea would call it entirely predictable. She had been saying so for 3 years. Let me tell you about Hardin County in the summer, because you need to understand the place before you can understand what happened there. Hardin County sits in the middle of Iowa, flat and rich and relentless. The kind of country where the horizon is so far away, it feels like a promise the land is making to you. The corn grows tall there, the soybeans grow dense, and the hay has always been baled the same way. You cut it, you let it dry in the field, you bale it when the moisture meter reads somewhere between 16 and 20%, and you stack it in the barn. That was the system. That was the only system. Every farmer in Hardin County did it that way, and their fathers had done it that way, and their fathers' fathers had done it that way, and nobody had ever seriously proposed doing it any differently. It wasn't a decision anyone made. It was just the shape of the world. The problem with that system, and there was a problem, a serious one, a dangerous one, was that a moisture meter tells you the average moisture content of a bale, not the moisture content at the core. And hay doesn't dry from the outside in. It dries unevenly. The outside of a bale can read 18%, while the center of that same bale is still holding 26, 28, even 30% moisture. And at that moisture level, microbial activity inside the bale generates heat. Not a little heat. Enough heat to ignite. Enough heat to burn a barn down from the inside out. With no spark, no lightning strike, no careless cigarette. Just wet hay stacked in a dry barn, doing what wet hay does when nobody is watching. This was not a secret. The agricultural extension literature had been publishing warnings about it for decades. But in Hardin County, in the summer of 2019, the warnings might as well have been written in a language nobody spoke. Let me tell you about the summer that preceded those fires, because the weather that year made everything worse. June had been wet. Not unusually wet, but persistently wet. The kind of wet that keeps you off the field 3 days out of every 7. July dried out late, which meant the first cutting came in behind schedule, which meant farmers were rushing the second cutting, baling faster than the hay had time to properly field cure, reading the surface moisture and calling it good. The pressure to get the hay in was real. Feed costs were high, storage was limited, and every day a bale sat in the field was a day it could get rained on again. So farmers baled it a little wet, stacked it a little tight, and told themselves the barn would take care of the rest. The barn always had before. Except that summer it didn't. The first fire in Hardin County that August was on the Peterson operation, northeast of Eldora, where 200 large round bales stored in a pole barn went up on a Tuesday afternoon. Nobody was hurt, but the barn was a total loss, and the hay with it. The second fire came 8 days later, on a smaller place off County Road S56, where a family had stacked small square bales in a timber frame barn their grandfather had built. That barn burned to the foundation. By the 3rd week of August, the county extension office had fielded more calls about hay fires in 3 weeks than it normally received in 3 years. And the fire marshal was driving from farm to farm with a clipboard and a tired expression, writing the same words in the same boxes on the same forms. Spontaneous combustion, excessive moisture at storage. No negligence found. Linnea Vandermeer had been watching all of this from the Vandermeer farm on the east side of the county, and she was not surprised. She was not surprised because she had spent the better part of 3 years trying to explain exactly this scenario to anyone who would listen, and almost nobody had. Let me tell you about Linnea Vandermeer, because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from every other character this channel has ever told you about. Linnea was 23 years old in the summer of 2019. She had grown up on the Vandermeer farm, 480 acres of row crops and hay ground that her father, Garrett Vandermeer, had farmed for 31 years with the same methodical consistency he brought to everything. Garrett was a good farmer, not a flashy one, not an innovative one, but a careful one. The kind of man who kept meticulous records, serviced his equipment on schedule, and had strong opinions about the right way to do things that were almost always grounded in experience and almost never open to revision. He had farmed hay the same way his whole life. He had never had a barn fire. He considered this evidence that the system worked. Linnea had gone to Iowa State in the fall of 2014 and studied agricultural science, which in itself was not unusual for a farm kid from Hardin County. What was unusual was the elective she took in her junior year, a course on forage management taught by a professor named Dr. Anita Sorensen, who had spent 15 years studying hay curing and storage systems and had opinions about Midwestern baling practices that were considered, in polite academic company, somewhat provocative. Dr. Sorensen was not a barn fire alarmist. She was a data person, and her data, assembled from field trials in Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin over a decade and a half, said clearly and without ambiguity that the standard Midwestern practice of baling to surface moisture and stacking tight in enclosed barns was producing internal bale temperatures that exceeded safe thresholds in a statistically significant percentage of cases. Not occasionally, routinely, every summer, in barns across the Midwest. And the reason nobody was talking about it was not that the problem didn't exist. It was that most of the time the hay smoldered and cooled without igniting, and nobody ever knew how close they had come. Linnea sat in that classroom and felt the specific electricity of someone hearing a thing that explained something they had always half known, but never had words for. She wrote 12 pages of notes in 3 class sessions. She stayed after to ask questions. She borrowed 3 of Dr. Sorensen's published papers and read them twice. And when she came home for Christmas that year, she sat down at the kitchen table with her father and told him she thought they needed to change how they cured and stored their hay. Let me tell you about that kitchen table conversation, because it is the beginning of everything that followed. Garrett Vandermeer was a patient man, and he let his daughter talk. Linnea had brought a folder, a real folder, the kind with pockets, stuffed with printed papers and handwritten notes, and she laid it out on the table between the salt shaker and the bread basket and walked him through what she had learned. She talked about internal bale temperature. She talked about the difference between surface moisture and core moisture. She talked about the microbial activity that happens in the first 72 hours after baling and how that window is when the heat builds and either dissipates or doesn't. She talked about stack spacing and airflow and the specific geometry of how bales should be arranged to allow heat to escape rather than accumulate. She talked about Dr. Sorensen's field trial data, which showed that farms using open stack or loose stack curing methods, stacking bales with deliberate air gaps rather than tight against each other, saw internal temperatures peak and drop safely in nearly every case, while tightly stacked bales in enclosed barns showed dangerous temperature spikes in roughly 1 in 4 storage events. Her father listened to all of it. He ate his dinner while she talked. He looked at the papers she had printed. He was quiet for a moment after she finished, and then he said, "We've never had a fire." Linnea said, "Not yet." Her mother, Anka, who had been quiet at the other end of the table, said softly, "She's right, you know." Garrett looked at his wife. He looked at his daughter. He picked up one of the papers and read the first paragraph. He set it down and said he needed to think about it. He thought about it for 3 years without changing anything. Let me tell you about the science of loose stack hay curing, because you need to understand what Linnea was actually proposing before you can understand why people found it so easy to dismiss. The traditional method, bale it, stack it tight, store it inside, is efficient. It uses space well. It protects hay from weather. It is fast. Those are real advantages, and they explain why the method became standard. What it does not do is allow the heat generated by microbial activity in the first days after baling to escape. When you stack bales tightly against each other in an enclosed space, you create an insulating mass. The heat that the bales generate has nowhere to go. In dry hay, hay that is genuinely dry throughout, not just on the surface, this is not a serious problem because the microbial activity is minimal. But in hay that has any significant core moisture, and in a wet summer like 2019, almost all hay has significant core moisture, the heat builds. Internal temperatures in a tightly stacked bale can reach 150 degrees Fahrenheit within 48 hours of storage. At 170 degrees, you have a fire risk. At 190 degrees, you have a fire. Not might have. The loose stack method that Dr. Sorensen's research endorsed, and that similar research from the University of Minnesota and the USDA Forage Laboratory in Madison, Wisconsin, had been validating since the 1990s, works differently. You stack bales with deliberate air gaps, 4 to 6 inches between large round bales, 2 to 3 inches between small squares. You orient the stacks to allow cross-ventilation. You use the first 2 weeks after baling as a curing period, during which the bales are accessible and monitored, not sealed away. The heat still builds, but it has somewhere to go. It peaks lower, typically under 130 degrees, and it dissipates within 10 to 14 days, after which the hay is genuinely stable and can be stacked tighter for long-term storage. The total square footage required during the curing period is roughly 40% greater than tight stacking. That is the cost. The benefit is that your barn does not burn down. Linnea had proposed this system to her father in the winter of 2016. She had proposed it again in the spring of 2017, with additional data from a field trial Dr. Sorensen had conducted that summer in Story County. She had proposed it a third time in the spring of 2018, by which point she had graduated, come back to the farm full-time, and was doing a significant portion of the haying work herself. Each time, Garrett had listened, acknowledged that the research was interesting, and continued doing what he had always done. He was not a dismissive man. He simply could not make himself believe that a practice he had followed for 30 years without incident was the kind of practice that needed changing. The absence of disaster felt like evidence of safety. Linnea understood that feeling. She also understood, from Dr. Sorensen's data, that it was a form of reasoning that the numbers did not support. Now, let me tell you about the conversation that finally pushed things into the open, because it did not happen at the Vandermeer kitchen table. It happened at the Hardin County Farm Bureau meeting in the spring of 2019, in the basement of the Lutheran Church in Eldora, on a Wednesday evening in April, when the room smelled like coffee and old carpet and the particular combination of patience and stubbornness that fills any room where Midwestern farmers have gathered to talk about their business. The meeting was routine. Equipment costs, crop insurance updates, a presentation from the county extension agent about cover crop options. Linnea had come with her father, which she always did, and she had brought her notebook, which she always did, and she had been sitting quietly in the third row, which she always did, until the extension agent opened the floor for questions and someone in the back asked about hay storage best practices given the wet springs they had been seeing. The extension agent gave a careful, measured answer about moisture meters and proper drying time. And then, from the front of the room, a voice said, "That's all well and good, but the moisture meter's only telling you half the story." The voice was Linnea's. She had not planned to say it. She said it anyway. The room turned. Garrett turned. And from the far side of the room, near the coffee urn, a man named Dale Crowley looked up from his styrofoam cup with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite a frown, but something in between. The expression of a man who has just heard something he finds mildly amusing. Let me tell you about Dale Crowley, because you need to understand who he was in that room. Dale Crowley was 61 years old and had been selling hay equipment and storage systems for Crowley Farm Supply in Eldora for 28 years. He was not a bad man. He was a knowledgeable man, genuinely knowledgeable, the kind of dealer who could talk about equipment specifications and curing chemistry and storage geometry with real fluency. He had sold equipment to nearly every farmer in Hardin County. He had opinions about hay storage that were confident and consistent and grounded in 28 years of watching Hardin County farmers do things one particular way without their barns burning down. He was the kind of man who holds court at the coffee urn at Farm Bureau meetings, and people listen to him because he has been right often enough that they have stopped checking whether he is right this time. He set down his cup. He walked to the front of the room. He looked at Linnea with the particular patience of a man who's about to explain something obvious to someone young, and he said, "The moisture meter tells you exactly what you need to know, sweetheart. It tells you the moisture content of the hay." Linnea said, "It tells you the surface moisture content. It doesn't tell you the core." Crowley smiled. It was not a mean smile. It was worse than a mean smile. It was a patient one. The smile of a man who has heard something he considers a beginner's error and is preparing to correct it gently. "Honey," he said, "I've been selling hay equipment in this county since before you were born. You want to tell me about core moisture?" He looked around the room, and a few people chuckled, not cruelly, just the reflexive chuckle of a room that has decided which person it is comfortable agreeing with. You go ahead and stack your bales with 4-inch air gaps if you want to. You'll need a barn twice the size and twice as long to cure your hay, and you'll spend the whole summer walking around with a thermometer poking at bales while the rest of us are getting work done. The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Linnea did not flush. She did not look at her father. She opened her notebook to a page she had clearly had ready for some time and said, "The University of Minnesota field trial from 2014 showed internal bale temperatures exceeding 170 degrees in 23% of tightly stacked bales stored in enclosed structures during high humidity curing conditions." Dr. Sorensen's Story County trial in 2017 showed the same result in 19% of cases. 1 in 5 bales, Mr. Crowley. That's not a fringe risk, that's a routine one. Crowley's smile did not disappear. It got smaller. "Young lady," he said, "I respect that you went to school and you read some papers, but this is Hardin County. We know our hay, we know our barns, and we know what works." He picked up his coffee cup. You want to run an experiment on your daddy's farm? You go right ahead. Just don't come to me when your neighbors are laughing at your air gap stacks." He walked back to the coffee urn. The meeting moved on. Garrett Vandermeer sat very still in the third row and did not say anything for a long time. On the drive home, he said, "You should have told me you were going to do that." Linnea said, "I didn't know I was going to do that." He was quiet for a mile. Then he said, "Plant your 40 acres of hay ground with the new method this summer, the 40 on the south end near the creek. We'll see what the numbers say." It was not enthusiastic permission. It was not warm permission. But it was permission. Let me tell you about the summer of 2019 on the Vandermeer farm, because it was two farms operating side by side, and the difference between them was 40 acres and one decision. Garrett ran his 440 acres the way he always had. He cut, he tedded, he baled when the meter read 18%. He stacked the bales tied in the big hay barn near the road. He was efficient. He was fast. He got his first cutting in by the third week of June, his second cutting in by late July, and his third cutting was shaping up well when August arrived and the county started burning. Linnea ran her 40 acres differently. She cut the same days as her father. She tedded the same way, but she baled 3 to 4 days later than her father did, waiting for the hay to reach what she called genuine field cure. Not just surface dry, but dry enough that the center of the windrow had lost most of its moisture to the air. She baled to 14% surface moisture instead of 18%. She stacked her bales with deliberate air gaps, oriented north-south to catch the prevailing summer breeze, and she checked internal temperatures with a probe thermometer every 48 hours for the first 2 weeks. She kept a notebook. She wrote down every reading. Her peak internal temperature across that first cutting was 118 degrees Fahrenheit. It peaked at day 4 and dropped to ambient by day 11. She moved the bales to tight storage on day 15. Her hay was stable, dense, and good. Her father's first cutting, stacked tight in the big barn, peaked at what she estimated, based on the heat she could feel radiating from the barn wall on day 3, at somewhere well above 130 degrees. She asked her father if she could probe his stacks. He said no. She didn't push it. She wrote down her estimate in the notebook anyway. And then, on a Tuesday morning in the third week of August, while the Peterson barn was still smoldering northeast of Eldora and the fire marshal was still writing his report, Garrett Vandermeer walked out to his big hay barn at 6 in the morning and smelled smoke. Let me tell you about that morning because it is the reason this story is still being told. The smoke was faint. Not the thick gray smoke of an active fire, but the thin, acrid smell of something hot and wrong. The smell of hay that has crossed a threshold it cannot come back from. Garrett opened the barn door and the heat hit him in the face like an oven. He could see, in the far corner of the barn, a section of the stacked bales that had gone dark. Not black, not charred, but the deep brown of hay that is cooking from the inside. He called the fire department. He called his wife. He called Linnea. By the time Linnea arrived, 2 fire trucks were in the yard, and the firefighters were pulling bales out of the barn with hooks, separating them, dragging them into the open air where they steamed in the morning light like something alive. 3 bales in the center of the south stack had reached ignition temperature. Another 4 hours, and the barn would have been gone. The hay was a total loss. All 440 bales of the second cutting, $47,000 at current prices, plus the cost of the barn repair and the equipment that had been stored inside. The barn itself survived, barely, because they had caught it early enough. Garrett stood in the yard and watched his firefighters work and did not say anything for a very long time. Linnea stood beside him. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say anything at all. She just stood there with him in the yard while the bales steamed and the firefighters moved and the August sun came up over the flat Hardin County fields. And after a while, Garrett put his hand on her shoulder and left it there. Later that morning, when the fire trucks had gone and the yard was quiet, Garrett walked down to the south end of the farm where Linnea's 40 acres of loose stacked hay sat in the field shelter she had built from salvaged lumber, open-sided, oriented north-south, bales spaced and cool and stable. He stood in front of it for a long time. He reached out and put his hand on the nearest bale. It was cool, room temperature, dry and dense and good. He said, "Show me the numbers." Linnea went inside and got her notebook. Let me tell you about what was in that notebook because it is the heart of the whole story. The notebook was a standard composition book, the black and white kind, and Linnea had been keeping it since the spring of 2019. Every page was dated. Every entry had a temperature reading, a moisture reading, a weather note, and a calculation. She had tracked the internal temperature of every bale stack she managed, every 48 hours, from the day of baling through the day she moved the bales to tight storage. She had tracked her father's barn temperature from the outside, the ambient temperature at the barn wall, which she knew from Dr. Sorensen's research was a rough but usable proxy for internal stack temperature when the wall was radiating heat. She had calculated her yield per acre, her baling cost per ton, and her estimated feed value per dollar spent. She had done the same calculations for her father's operation using his records, which he kept on a yellow legal pad in the kitchen, and which he had shown her willingly because he believed in keeping records even when he didn't believe in changing anything. The numbers were not subtle. Linnea's 40 acres had produced 4.2 tons of hay per acre, which was slightly below her father's 4.6 tons per acre. She had lost a small amount of yield by waiting for fuller field cure, but her hay had zero storage loss. Her father's operation, in a normal year, lost between 8 and 12% of stored hay to heat, damage, mold, and spoilage, not fire, just the routine degradation of hay that was stored too wet. In the year of the fire, his storage loss was total on the second cutting. Linnea's was zero. Her cost per ton of usable hay, accounting for all inputs, was $84. Her father's cost per ton of usable hay, in the year of the fire, was $247 on the second cutting and $96 in a normal year. Even in a normal year, her method was 12% cheaper per ton of usable feed. In a bad year, it was the difference between feeding your cattle and buying hay at emergency prices from 3 counties away. Garrett read the notebook standing up. He turned pages slowly. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "Why didn't you show me this before?" Linnea said, "I showed you the projections before. You said you needed to see it on the farm." He nodded. He turned another page. He said, "What would it take to convert the whole operation?" She had that answer ready too. She had been ready with that answer for 3 years. She told him, a second open-sided field shelter, roughly $8,000 in materials if they built it themselves, a change in baling schedule, 4 days later on average, which meant some juggling with the weather window but nothing unmanageable, a probe thermometer and a monitoring protocol for the first 2 weeks of storage, and a willingness to accept a slightly lower yield per acre in exchange for dramatically lower storage loss. Garrett closed the notebook. He handed it back to her. He said, "You decide the rotation." Those 4 words were the most trust Garrett Vandermeer had ever transferred to another human being in 31 years of farming. Now let me tell you about what happened in the weeks after the fire, because the story doesn't end in the Vandermeer yard. The fires that summer had shaken Hardin County, in a way that a single barn fire never quite does. When 3 barns burn in 3 weeks, all from the same cause, all from the same practice that every farmer in the county uses, it stops being bad luck and starts being a question. People drove past the Peterson place and looked at the black foundation where the pole barn had been. They drove past the place off County Road S56 and saw the bare concrete slab. They went to the Farm Bureau meeting in September, and they were quieter than they had been in April, and the questions they asked were different questions, not about equipment and schedules, but about whether what they were doing was safe. Linnea went to that September meeting with her notebook. She had not been invited to present. She sat in the 3rd row again. When the floor opened for questions, she raised her hand and asked the extension agent if she could share some data from a field trial she had run on her family's farm that summer. The extension agent, a careful and fair-minded man named Tom Briggs, said yes. She stood up and talked for 12 minutes. She put numbers on the whiteboard. Internal temperature curves, cost per ton comparisons, the specific conditions under which the Vandermeer second cutting had reached ignition temperature, and the specific conditions under which her 40-acre loose stack operation had not. She quoted Dr. Sorensen. She quoted the University of Minnesota. She quoted the USDA Forage Laboratory report from 2011. She was calm and specific, and she did not editorialize. She just put the numbers on the board and let the room look at them. The room was very quiet. Dale Crowley was there. He sat near the coffee urn, as always, but he did not walk to the front of the room. He did not smile. He held his styrofoam cup in both hands and looked at the numbers on the whiteboard and did not say anything for the entire 12 minutes. After the meeting, 3 farmers came up to Linnea and asked her for copies of her data. 2 more asked if they could come out to the farm and see the field shelter. Tom Briggs asked if she would be willing to present at the county extension field day in October. She said yes. Let me tell you about the October field day, because it was a different kind of moment than the April meeting. The field day was held at the Vandermeer farm, at Linnea's suggestion and her father's agreement. 41 farmers came. 41 was a significant number for a Hardin County field day. The usual attendance was 15 to 20. People came because 3 barns had burned that summer, and they wanted to understand why, and they had heard that the Vandermeer girl had something to say about it. Garrett stood near the barn and watched them arrive. He shook hands with men he had farmed next to for 30 years. He did not say much. Linnea walked 41 farmers through the field shelter. She showed them the bale spacing. She showed them the orientation. She showed them the temperature logs from the summer. Every reading, every date, the full curve from peak to stable. She showed them the cost per ton comparison. She showed them what a bale that had been through safe loose stack curing looked like versus a bale that had been through tight stack heat damage. The color difference, the smell difference, the density difference. She answered questions for 90 minutes. She was 23 years old, and she spoke with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this conversation for 3 years, because she had. At the end of the field day, Tom Briggs stood up and said that the Hardin County Extension Service would be incorporating loose stack curing protocols into its official hay management recommendations, effective for the following season. He thanked Linnea by name. He said her data was among the most rigorous field documentation he had seen from a private farm operation in his 12 years as county agent. Garrett Vandermeer, standing near the barn door, started clapping. He was the first one to clap. He clapped slowly and steadily, the way a man claps when he is not a demonstrative person, but he means it completely, and after a moment the 41 farmers clapped with him. Linnea looked at her father. He nodded once. She nodded back. That was the whole conversation. Let me tell you about what happened with Dale Crowley, because the story doesn't end at the field day either. Dale Crowley did not come to the October field day. He had been at the September Farm Bureau meeting, and he had seen the numbers on the whiteboard, and he had driven home that night and sat in his truck in the driveway of his house for a while before going inside. His wife asked him how the meeting was. He said it was fine. Over the winter, Crowley Farm Supply started getting calls from farmers asking about open-sided field shelters and probe thermometers and bale spacing equipment. Dale handled the calls himself. He gave good information. He was a knowledgeable man, genuinely knowledgeable, and once he understood that the market was moving, he moved with it. But he did not reach out to Linnea. Not in September, not in October, not in November or December. He came to the Vandermeer farm on a Tuesday morning in March of 2020, when the ground was still frozen and the fields were bare and there was nothing growing anywhere to remind you that summer and hay and all the decisions that go with them were only a few months away. He drove up the lane in his truck and parked in the yard and knocked on the farmhouse door. Anka Vandermeer answered. She called for Linnea. Linnea came to the door in her Carhartt jacket, which she had been wearing since November and which was by now thoroughly broken in, stained with grease and field dirt and the particular grime of a person who works outdoors in cold weather. She had been in the machine shed. She looked at Dale Crowley standing on the porch and waited. He said, "I've got 12 farmers who want to convert their hay operations before next summer. They want to do it right. They've been asking me questions I don't have good answers to." He paused. He was not a man who found the next sentence easy to say. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk to them." Linnea looked at him for a moment. She said, "You told the room I'd need a barn twice the size." He said, "I know what I said." She said, "You called me sweetheart." He said, "I know that too." She let him stand on the porch for another moment, not to be cruel, just because the moment deserved to exist. Then she opened the door wider and said, "Come in. I'll make coffee. You can look at the numbers." He came in. He sat at the kitchen table where the notebook had been laid out 3 years before, and Linnea put the composition book in front of him along with 2 seasons of follow-up data she had compiled through the winter, and she walked him through all of it. She talked for an hour. He asked good questions. He was genuinely knowledgeable, and once he was actually looking at the data instead of dismissing it, he was a useful person to talk to. They disagreed about 2 things: the optimal bale spacing for large rounds versus small squares, and the minimum field cure time in a dry summer versus a wet one. And the disagreement was productive, the kind of disagreement between 2 people who were both trying to get to the right answer. Before he left, he said, "I should have listened to you in April." Linnea said, "The lesson isn't that loose stack curing is better than tight stack. The lesson is that any operation that never questions its storage method is an operation that needs only one bad summer to find out what it didn't know." He nodded. He picked up his hat. He said, "I'll send those 12 farmers your way." He sent 22. Let me tell you about the 3 years that followed, because the story doesn't end in that kitchen either. By the summer of 2021, 67 farms in Hardin County had adopted some version of the loose stack curing protocol that Linnea had documented and presented. Not all of them did it exactly the way she did. Some used temporary tarped structures instead of open-sided shelters. Some used different spacing. Some monitored less rigorously than she did, but all of them were doing something they had not been doing in 2018, which was thinking about core moisture and internal temperature as real variables that required real management. The county extension service had published a guidance document that cited Dr. Sorensen's research and the Vandermeer farm field data. Tom Briggs presented it at the Iowa State Extension Conference in Des Moines in January of 2021 and credited Linnea by name in his slides. There were no spontaneous combustion barn fires in Hardin County in 2020. There were none in 2021. In 2022, there was one, on a farm that had not adopted the new protocol, on the west side of the county, where the owner had decided the whole thing was overcomplication and had kept doing what he had always done. The fire marshal's report said spontaneous combustion. The neighbors said bad luck. The county extension agent sent the farm a copy of the guidance document the following week. Garrett Vandermeer converted the entire 480-acre operation to loose stack curing in the spring of 2020. He built the second field shelter himself with Linnea's help over 4 days in April. He was meticulous about it. He always was meticulous, that was never the issue. And when it was done, he stood back and looked at it and said it was a good structure. He meant more than the structure. That summer, Garrett kept his own temperature log for the first time. He used a composition book identical to Linnea's. He checked the probe thermometer every 48 hours and wrote down the numbers in the same format she used. He did not tell her he was doing this. She found out when she walked past his workbench in August and saw the notebook sitting open, his handwriting filling the columns she had designed, the temperature curves tracking exactly where the data said they should track. She picked it up and read the last 3 entries. She set it back down. She did not say anything about it. She didn't need to. Let me tell you about the spring of 2023 because it is where the story finds its shape. Linnea was 27 by then. She had been running the Vandermeer hay operation for 4 years, and she had expanded it. They had added 80 acres of hay ground on a lease from a neighbor who had retired, and she had developed a small consulting side operation, helping other farms in the county design their curing protocols and monitoring systems. She drove a truck that needed new shocks and wore a cap she had gotten at a seed company field day in 2021 and carried the same composition notebook she had always carried, though she was on her 4th one now. In April of 2023, she was sitting at the kitchen table going over seed costs when her daughter, Marta, 4 years old, serious-faced, with her grandfather's dark eyes, came in from the backyard carrying a jar of dirt. She set the jar on the table next to the seed catalog. She said, "Mama, why don't we grow sunflowers?" Linnea looked at the jar. She looked at her daughter. Marta had been watching her mother work since she could walk, and she had the particular curiosity of a child who has grown up around notebooks and numbers and questions. Linnea said, "What do you mean?" Marta said, "Mrs. Gustafson has sunflowers. They're tall. Do they make food?" Linnea said, "They make oil and seeds, and they do something else too. They have very deep roots that break up hard soil, and they don't need as much water as corn." She paused. She looked at the jar of dirt. She thought about Dr. Sorensen's classroom, and the kitchen table in 2016, and the Farm Bureau meeting in April of 2019, and the 41 farmers standing in the field shelter in October. She thought about what it had cost to propose something different, and what it had cost not to. She said, "That's actually a good question." She got up and went to the shelf where she kept her agricultural research folders. She pulled out a thick one. She had been building it for 2 years, almost without admitting to herself that she was building it, and she sat back down at the table and opened it. Marta climbed into the chair beside her and looked at the papers with the serious expression she brought to everything. Linnea turned to the first page, which was a field trial summary from the University of Nebraska on oilseed sunflower production in rotation with corn and soybeans on high-residue ground. She read for a while. Marta looked at the pictures. Then Linnea heard her father's boots on the porch. The door opened. Garrett came in, took off his cap, looked at the table. He saw the folder. He saw the jar of dirt. He looked at Marta, who looked back at him with his own dark eyes. He said, "What are we reading?" Linnea looked up at him. She said, "Marta wants to know why we don't grow sunflowers." Garrett sat down at the table. He pulled the folder toward him. He read the first page. He turned to the second. He was quiet for a moment, the same quiet he had been quiet in for 31 years of farming, the quiet of a man reading something carefully. Then he said, "Show me the numbers." He did not say he needed to think about it. He did not say they had never done it before. He did not say the neighbors would find it amusing or that he wasn't sure the county was ready for it. He just said, "Show me the numbers," because 4 years and 1 barn fire and 67 converted farms had taught him something that no amount of talking had been able to teach him. That the person most worth listening to is sometimes the one the room is least prepared to hear. Linnea turned to page 3, where the yield data started. Marta put her jar of dirt in the center of the table, between the salt shaker and the bread basket, in the exact spot where the folder had been 7 years before, and nobody moved it. Let me tell you one last thing about Linnea Vandermeer because it matters. She still farms those 480 acres, plus the 80-acre lease, plus a second lease she added in 2022. She still carries the composition notebook. She has given the loose stack curing presentation at 3 Iowa State Extension Field Days, 1 Regional Forage Conference in Ames, and a USDA-sponsored workshop on hay fire prevention that drew farmers from 11 states. Dr. Anita Sorensen was in the audience at the Ames conference. She sat in the front row. When Linnea finished speaking, Dr. Sorensen stood up first. The original composition book, the black and white one from 2019, the one with the temperature logs and the cost per ton comparisons and the data that Garrett read standing up in the field shelter on the morning after the fire, sits on the shelf in the Vandermeer farmhouse kitchen, between a seed catalog and a jar of dirt that Marta has never let anyone throw away. Garrett Vandermeer still farms. He still keeps his own temperature log every summer in a composition book identical to Linnea's, in the same format with the same column headings. He has never missed a reading. Dale Crowley retired from Crowley Farm Supply in 2022. His son runs the business now and carries probe thermometers and bale spacing guides in stock as standard inventory year-round, without anyone having to ask. There have been no spontaneous combustion barn fires on any farm using the Vandermeer protocol in Hardin County since 2019. Linnea planted sunflowers on 40 acres in 2024. The neighbors drove past and looked. Some of them shook their heads. Some of them stopped and asked questions. One of them called Dale Crowley's son and asked if he stocked anything useful for an oilseed operation. She planted sunflowers in a corn county. The neighbors looked. The data is still coming in. The notebook is already open. The ground doesn't care what crop your county is known for. It just grows what it's given a reason to grow.